Welcome to the next unit of Module 5, where we look at the narration of the nation. We took a look at how the nation was formed through the script and the role that the script played in the imagining of the nation, and also the fragmentation of undivided India. Now we look at the narration of the nation, taking forward the idea proposed by Frederick Jameson as well as Benedict Anderson about the role of fiction and newspapers and printing in the production of, in the imagining of the nation, and Jameson's idea of all third world novels as allegories of the nation. We might disagree with Jameson's contention, as Ijaz Ahmed has done, but let us first look at the role that the nation played in the imagining of the nation. So, I am going to take up in this unit, I am going to take up two arguments, two aspects of the nation. First, I would look at how the nation was narrated imagined by fiction. So, the fiction becomes complicit in the narration of the nation, and then I would move on to how somewhere in the 80s or even earlier, as I have shown in the other unit, how the cracks in the nation began to appear and the idea of the nation came to be interrogated by, again, within the pages of fiction. Let us look at the idea of the master narrative of the nation and the founding fathers who scripted this master narrative of the nation, namely Raja Ram Mohan Roy, writers like Rabindranath Tagore, writers like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. And of course, we do not need an introduction to the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, and the dream of the modern Indian nation, Jawaharlal Nehru, and his idea of a secular democratic nation. What is important for us is how the novel becomes complicit in this imagining of the nation and the imagined community of the nation, and the role that ideologues such as Bharatendu Harishchandra and novelists like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, along with novelists writing in other languages, in the other Indian bhashas, became implicated in the imagining of this narrative of the nation. New research such as Rumina Sethi's book Myths of the Nation has shown how the construction of it focuses on the construction of forms of historical consciousness in narratives or school of narrative, and she shows what goes behind the writing of true and authentic histories by treating historical fiction as the literary dimension of nationalist ideology. So, what we are interested in is how this Nehruvian ideology, how the nationalist ideology is reflected in fiction, and her book traces nationalism from its abstract underpinnings to its concrete manifestation in historical fiction, which underwrites the Indian freedom struggle. And more new work like Kittle's work on the novel of the 20s and the 30s shows how the representation of proto-national identity in Indian English fiction before the formative nationalist novels of the 1920s and 30s. It shows the connections between Indian English fiction and the secularism of the Nehruvian national project. So, this is our concern, how the secular Nehruvian project is translated in the writings of the 1920s and 30s and even earlier, as this book shows. As he shows that primordialist nationalism and culturally transacted concepts of communal racial identity were key elements in the political imagining of early Indian fiction in English, taking up the works of Sharat Kumar Ghosh's The Prince of Destiny and S. M. Mitra's Hindupur. More recently, Ulka Anjaria's work shows that there was nothing inherently unified about the diverse cultures, religions, languages that comprise the Indian subcontinent under colonialism. So, what she points out is that this brief was the idea of European model of nationalism, which took for granted the existence of one religion, one language or one ethnicity, was doomed to failure, and for this reason British argued that India was not fit to rule itself. And she shows that this idea on behalf of this sense of identity, that beginning in the 19th century, Indian writers of literature, not just Indian writers in English, but Indian writers of literature, began to imagine cultural unity through their fictional and poetic works. By the 20s and 30s, literature had come to occupy a central role in the Indian nationalist movement. So, we are looking in literature, particularly novel, as the site for the imagining as well as the mobilization of this idea of the unity of the nation, or even the idea of the nation. And this intersection of politics and fiction in the process of national formation in English Indian fiction during the 20th century, she looks at that and does this by explaining the position of the writer in the process of decolonization. The central question of this project, as she puts it, is the construction of fiction of political developments during the processes of national formation in India, and how an English Indian novelist reflects upon these issues. So, the active involvement of the English Indian writer in this imagining or in the scripting of the master narrative of the nation. And again, Rosemary George's new work shows that during the, and she shows the direct complicity and the involvement of the writers in the nationalist project, and shows that the writers were given the brief to create this image of a unified, seemingly caste-free, modernized India for consumption both at home. So, during the 20th century, at the height of the independence movement and after, Indian literary writing in English, according to her, was specifically given the brief, was entrusted with the task of consolidating the image of a unified, seemingly caste-free, modernizing India. And this led to a critical insistence on the proximity of the national and the literary, which in turn led to the canonization of certain writers and themes and the dismissal of others. The painstaking efforts that went into the elaboration of a national literature in English for independent India, she focuses on that. And another new study looks at how the Mahatma misunderstood, demonstrates. So, it complicates the story of the involvement or implication of the writers in Indian languages or bhashas as well as English in the nationalist projects by showing that the nationalist fiction, by extension the nationalist political movement, was marked from the beginning by a deep ambivalence about the relevance of nationalist agitation and mainstream nationalist politics for minorities in colonial India, and sought to recast anti-colonial politics through novelistic debates with the spokesman for Indian nationalism, namely Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Now, we take a look at some of these novelists who gave their consent to the master narrative of the nation and helped to script that master narrative. We begin with Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who is considered the father of the Indian novel and as one of the most important Indian political novelists of the anti-colonial era. His book Anand Math is considered a foundational text for the understanding of Indian nationalism, and the hymn Bande Mataram, Hail Mother, in Anand Math became the unofficial anthem during the partition of Bengal in 1905 and in the ensuing struggle for independence from British rule. It is in Anand Math that the first national imagining of the nation as mother in Indian fiction, which became naturalized in all narrative genres, began. Now, I quickly take a look at three three novelists, the first generation of Indian novelists in English, the triumvirate or the troika, whose writing is often cited as central to the imagining of the nation through their direct involvement in the nationalist movement or indirect engagement with the idea of the nation in the writings. And the most of these the three novelists, they were not only influential in their own lifetime, but they all lived well into the 90s and had a very important role in the shaping of the idea of Indian fiction in English. So this idea of, I will not have time to go into their individual oeuvre and dwell on the aesthetic merit of their work, but I would merely focus on how these three writers, along with the writers in Hindi like Premchand and Bengali like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, constitute that generation of writers who we call the nationalist generation, who played a key role in scripting or narrating the idea of the nation, and their novels were appropriated by the nationalist movement to a certain extent through this idea to the formation of the canon of Indian literature, to show how the novel becomes implicitly involved in the imagining of the nation. I'll quickly run through these slides to show you that their own personal histories were very diverse. Mulk Raj Anand, as you can see through his biography, was born in North India and Punjab and lived in several places, went to England, was educated where he encountered European ideas and history, and yet it was in his school years, teenage years, that he was introduced to nationalist political activity, to non-violent campaigning and to imprisonment, inspired initially by a talk given at the college by the activist Annie Besant. Now, most of his novels narrate the nation from the perspective of the subaltern. His characters are all working class. Coolie, in the novel Coolie, in Untouchable, we have a Dalit character who is the protagonist of the novel, and a soldier in Across the Black Waters. So, in these novels, there is of course a dissonance between his own upper class or middle class location and his political commitment to narrate the nation from the perspective of the nation, from the perspective of the subaltern, and the subaltern becomes his instrument, his means to critique the master narrative of the nation, dominated by the upper class, upper caste male belonging the male elite. So, even as the nation is narrated in his novels, it also comes under a critique, because he looks at it, however faulty his understandings of the subaltern might be due to his own elite location, his sympathies with the subaltern and his desire, his intention to look at the nation from the perspective of the subaltern helps him to deconstruct the nation and to look at it from the subaltern perspective, from the lens of the subaltern, and how the nation impacts the subaltern. In R.K. Narayan, we have a very different biography and a movement to a very different region, to the south, and who's been raised in Chennai, and then he's educated, the son of a school teacher who had his loyalties to the British, and in spite of his comparative non-involvement, direct non-involvement in the political movement, his novels are a testimony to his engagement with the idea of the nation from the perspective of the south of India, or which is often seen as a microcosm of his town of Malguri, we all have grown up reading about or watching on television. The town is often seen as a microcosm of the nation, and how looking at the nation from this small region or this small town in South India, he creates a community, he creates a town, he creates a space which is emblematic of the nation, and looks at it from the point of view of the middle class. So, there is a difference in the class and caste locations of Narayan and Anand, and then we move to the third novelist. In his novel The Waiting for the Mahatma is one of the novels where he directly engages with the Gandhian ideology, not uncritically. And then we move on to Raja Rao, the third writer in the time varied, whose novel Kantapura is seen as a very influential text, which deals directly with the civil disobedience movement of 1930s, with the Karnataka village as its location, where a formally educated young man motivates the village with instances of failure and fulfillment, exhilaration and exasperation. So, during this time, many activists and intellectuals came into the mainstream of national activity. They were not identified by a homogeneity of interests or grounded in any common theory of nationalism. The absence of common ground became one of the primary reasons for importing Western nationalism into India. Now, having looked at the idea of the nation as a narration, not the nation as a narration, but the narration of the nation or the scripting of the nation by the first generation of writers in India, writers both from bhashas and from writing in English. We move on to how the nation is interrogated. In another unit, we will be looking at how the nation is interrogated or deconstructed from the perspective of those voices of the nation which were marginalized in the construction of the nation. But in this particular unit, we would look at within Indian English, within the corpus of Indian English novel, we find a moment in this history when the idea of the nation is interrogated and the idea that nation is not real. So, the first questioning of the nation, the first interrogation of the idea of the nation, which today we say is being questioned in the era of globalization, as we hear about the demise of the nation state, impending demise of the nation state, and doubts are being cast about the validity or the relevance of the nation in the face of the new, in view of the new borderless world that we inhabit. We need to go back to this moment in literary history when the idea of the nation was first interrogated in the so-called when these voices of those who interrogated the idea of the nation were still not very voluble. The critics of the nation or those who questioned the nations were not very vocal. So, this interrogation of the idea of the nation first came from a novelist who was of Indian origin, who claimed to be of Indian origin, but who did not live in India, and how the nation became implicated in the new discourse on migrancy, hybridity and post-colonialism, about the need to imagine the nation beyond its boundaries to include the diaspora and the diasporic writer. So, this critique, which came from a diasporic writer who claimed India as his origin, but interrogated the idea of a Hindu nation and a Hindu idea by writing the nation from the perspective of a Muslim writer and from the idea of a Muslim protagonist, to show the cross fertilization of Hindu, Muslim, Sanskritic and Perso-Arabic identities in the original imagining of undivided India, and how these imaginings persisted at the everyday level even after independence, and how these boundaries were destroyed through to the idea of the myth of the nation, to the idea of the boundaries of the nation. And I quote from the novel that I am talking about is the novelist that I am talking about is Salman Rushdie, who doesn't need an introduction, but those of you who are not familiar with him, to the details of his life, I must tell you that he's a British Indian. He's considered a British Indian novelist and essayist who now lives in New York. And it was his second novel, Midnight's Children, 1981, published in 1981, which won the Booker Prize in 1981 and won the Booker of Bookers later. Now, Salman Rushdie, in his person as well as in writing, problematizes the idea of the nation, problematizes the idea of national identities, because as a person who is born in India, who lives, whose nationality is British, who now lives in New York, he forces us, his writing as well as in his person, he compels us to rethink the idea of the nation and national identity, or compels us to imagine compels us to imagine the boundaries of the nation beyond the geographical territories of the nation, to span the diasporas, to span the borders of the nation, to include imagine communities of the nation which do not inhabit the boundaries of the nation, but identify culturally or linguistically or empathize with the idea of the nation. So, it leads us to question the idea of national identity itself. His work combines magic realism with historical fiction and is concerned with the many connections, disruptions and migrations between Eastern and Western civilizations. So, in his person and in his writing, he contests the idea of national literatures and the nation, which is interrogated through the publication of Midnight's Children in 1981. Salman Rushdie himself is a migrant who dwells in travel, is born in Mumbai in 1947, left India to join school in England as a teenager while his parents migrated to Pakistan. Now he lives in New York. So, the question we need to ask is, where does Rushdie belong? To India, to Pakistan, to the UK or to the US? He is often claimed as Indian and claims India as his past. So, I will not have the time to go into Salman Rushdie as the poster boy of the media. I would not have time to go into how he is seen as embodying the ethic of migrancy and hybridity, on which in the formulation of the now quite jaded theory of post-colonialism or postmodernism. I would not have time to go into that. What I would like to look at is how this interrogation of the idea of the movement comes from a writer who is not whose nationality is not Indian, B, who doesn't belong to the core group who constituted or formed the idea of the nation, and C, the idea of this interrogation of the nation comes much earlier than the late 80s, when globalization is technically believed to have begun. It started with, we can look at the publication of Midnight's Children as that inaugural moment which initiates the discussion or debate on the idea of the nation, and it's the first time, or maybe a repetition of a history where a novel becomes the site for the emerging debate within India on the idea of the nation and what does India signify, where the novel becomes the starting point for these discussions on the fate of the nation, debates which begin much before the onset of globalization. So, this idea of the interrogation of the notion of nation state as a given entity and the idea that the nation was a myth a narrative produced by consensus is first articulated aesthetically in a fiction by Salman Rushdie, and since there's no better way to talk about it than to quote from the novel itself, I take the liberty of quoting from Midnight's Children, which succinctly summarize what Rushdie means by the idea of the nation, or how he critiques the nation. So he says that he's talking about 15th August 1947, and he says there was an extra festival on the calendar, a new myth to celebrate, because a nation which had never previously existed was about to win its freedom, catapulting us into a world which, although it had 5,000 years of history, although it had invented the game of chess and traded with Middle Kingdom Egypt, was nevertheless quite imaginary, into a mythical land, a country which would never exist except by the efforts of a phenomenal collective will, except in a dream we all agreed to dream, a collective fiction in which anything was possible, a fable rivaled only by two other mighty fantasies, money and God. So this idea of the nation as imagined, the nation as a myth, as a story, as a dream which existed only through collective imagining, which came into being only through consensus of a group of people or of a collectivity. That idea was best illustrated or elucidated by Salman Rushdie in Midnight's Children, which was later formalized by Anderson in his now famous book, Imagine Communities. Now, let's look at how Rushdie, who inaugurates this movement of movement from the nation to globalization by questioning the idea of the nation, by interrogating the idea of the nation. He also presages the movement towards globalization. In his inaugural lecture, Tanner lecture at Yale in 2002, Rushdie reflected on how frontiers and borders shape us, trying to confine us and yet lure us to cross. The first frontier, he said then, was the edge of the water, where at some point a living thing came up from the ocean and crossed the boundary and found that it could breathe outside water, unlike the countless others who had perished gasping for breath. So this questioning and interrogation of borders and frontiers which confine us, particularly those of nation states, Rushdie talks about free flows, the idea of free flowing movements. And so what I'm trying to say is that Rushdie stands at the cusp of the in-between state, as we are transiting from the era of nationalism to the era of globalization. Rushdie, in his person, through his own in-betweenness and his standing on the interstices of the nation and globalization, presages both, declares the death of the nation and also presages the movement towards globalization. So Rushdie continues, there were just fish who by chance learned how to crawl, and so in a way are we. It's the same drive, he adds, that made Columbus's ships head for the edge of the world, or the pioneers take to their covered wagons. The image of Armstrong taking his first moonwalk echoes the first movements of life on earth in our deepest natures. We are frontier crossing beings. So it's Rushdie first who talks about the presence of contact zones, who challenges the idea of insularity and talks about the presence of contact zones as the boundary crossing impulse as more natural to human beings than the boundaries which he sees are political and which are artificially constructed. And once that step is taken, Rushdie says, there's no going back, as he reminds us in another essay about the film The Wizard of Oz. The truth is, once we've left our childhood spaces, armed only with what we have and are, we understand that the real secret of the ruby slippers is not that there is no place like home, but rather that there is no longer any such place as home, except of course for the home we make, or the homes that we are made for us in Oz, which is anywhere and anyway, and except the place from which we began. So in these essays as well as his writings, he questions the idea of fixed boundaries, of fixed birthplaces, fixed places of origin, or the idea of essentialist national or nations or identities, by showing the reality of movement and how mobility problematizes these essentialist boundaries. Before I move on to the next notion, I would show how Rushdie anticipates the global movement, global era, and that's why he has been appropriated equally in Globalization. For instance, some say that two India-born novelists, Salman Rushdie, he is equated with other writers who are called, we talk about Salman Rushdie and his children, and Amitabh Ghosh have been seen the most successful in vividly portraying the lives of people transformed by globalization without explicitly using the word. Since the early 80s, Rushdie and Ghosh have written ambitious novels that give meaning to our globalized world without setting out to do just that. In their fiction, they have honored the individual's survival instinct, cheering his ability to adapt and change his own self. So what I am saying is that Rushdie's writing opened the floodgates for a lot of writing which followed in its wake by people who are now called Rushdie's children. They were begotten, or the novels which were begotten of Midnight's Children, which continue this debate on the interrogation of the nation and the presence of free-flowing movements of people, ideas, things, even in the past as well as in the present. So Rushdie, Ghosh and Globalization, they show the interconnectedness of nations, people and cultures by interweaving lives, the individual tossed about as real. Rushdie's Bollywood star in the Satanic Verses literally drops out of the sky when the airplane in which he is traveling gets blown up by terrorists. These individuals hold on to the territory they land on and build their own niches, mingling with the local culture, often enriching it, and just as often drawing from the culture around them, becoming less of what they were, but not quite like the others around them. And now I connect Rushdie to Ghosh. Like Rushdie's migrants in London suburbs are exotic for the locals, but when they transform the city around them, the city doesn't even notice, as in the chapter A City Visible but Unseen in the Satanic Verses. In so doing, Rushdie points out the dangers of multiculturalism. Connecting other worlds, Rushdie has taken his readers to Moorish Spain in The Moor's Last Sigh and The Enchantress of Florence. Rushdie's characters sometimes influence history, even if inadvertently. Think of Salim Sinai in Midnight's Children. So I would like to close by showing that Rushdie is the first novelist who not only questions the idea of the nation, but he is also the first novelist which talks about whose novels, through the mobility of their protagonists, through their movement between different cities, different continents, point to a history of globalization which predates the present history of globalization, which is believed to have begun in the late 80s. And Rushdie shows these connected histories, not only not only the colonial histories, but also pre-colonial histories, where Europe, India, Middle East were connected with one another through tracing the movements of protagonists who set sail from one part of the world to another world, not only from the east to the west, but also from the west to the east, to show the connections between cities as diverse as Florence and Sikri, between New York, London and Calcutta. So Rushdie is the first novelist who not only questions the idea of the nation, but also inaugurates the movement towards globalization, which is carried forward by his successors.